Well, good evening, everybody. It's good that you're all here again. I know that people who listen again tonight are people who truly want to study the Word of God. Because you might listen in the morning feeling this need to do and check off this box of worshiping. But those who listen at night are those who either A, didn't get an opportunity this morning, like those who work, or they're people who truly want to know about the Word of God. I love that. So I thank you for being here. Now let's talk about Moses. And because Moses is our focus, you know, Jacob has died, Joseph has died at the end of the book of Genesis. And here we come to the book of Exodus. And the reason it's called Exodus is because it's a great leaving of Egypt. And from now on, when God talks to the people of Israel, I'm talking about after they get into the promised land, and he's talking to them about Egypt, he's using it as a symbolic word to say, you're away from me. So when he says, don't have these allegiances with people, it'll put you in Egypt or put you in bondage. That's why he's saying you're going to be leaving me, you're going to be away from me. Remember what last time we talked about, excuse me, this famine that was going to come about was in effect the famine of the people were going to be away from God. And God was going to remember them and bring them back to him. And we don't understand necessarily why. But what we do know is that there are forces and things going on between God and Satan that we're not privileged to. But for some reason, this was necessary. And although it foretold about Jesus and what was going to happen with Jesus, what's going to happen that brings about the church, for some reason it was necessary here. And when we look back and see how sin was as great as it could be before Jesus came, we can see how it was influenced by the gods of Egypt. And but they weren't pristine to begin with. They were all still already worshiping idols and so on. So let's talk about Moses. Three things we're going to look at. The first thing is who Moses is, the man. And then the second thing we're going to look at is Moses, the deliverer. And then the third thing is Moses, the leader. Now, we're not going to go into the details about the delivery out of Egypt. We're going to do that next week. Because there are some specific things that we need to look at that are going to drive us to understand things that we do today and how we need to correct ourselves because we're doing the same thing that Israelites did then. Because what happens is they were intimate with idolatry, lies, so on that were in Egypt about who God is and how they're supposed to respond to God. So where we're going to start now is over in Ephesians 2 and we're going to start with the birth of Moses. Now it's interesting, we're going to combine here, when we're talking about the man, we're going to combine his birth and his raising together. We don't have much about it, but we do know some. And interesting part here is that before Moses was born, Pharaoh was, or the king, for some reason it's called the king there, and then later on Pharaoh, I don't know, it may be a thought process of being God, because they were worshipped as gods, and we see that happens. It happens today too. People are like, you look at nations who have the picture of their ruler on every wall. They sing songs to him and praise him and march before him and all these things as if he's a god. And then we see other people come into power and whether you like him or not, as to whether or not you put his picture up and care about him and so on and so forth. But we're going to talk here about Moses being born. But just before this, the king had told the midwives he was concerned about the fact that Israelites were growing in great number. Remember, we talked about that last week and how God has increased their number. And they became fearful of the fact that they would overtake the Egyptians, or at least they just give them leave. And so then the amount of people they had and the fact that they were slaves, they could tell them what to do, would be lost. So here he says, here's what you do. To the midwives, he says, you take every boy and you kill him, and every girl you can let them live. And so the midwives, some midwives, were still believed in God, and so they weren't doing that. And he asked them about it, and they said, well, the Hebrew women are just more capable than your Egyptian women, and they don't need us, and they have children before we get there, and so we don't have the opportunity to kill these children. So then the king makes the announcement, okay, everybody, if you have a boy child, you throw him in the River Nile. Now, the River Nile was notorious for crocodiles. In fact, they worshiped crocodiles. And the crocodiles would just eat all these kids, up. It's not just that they would drown, these crocodiles would just eat them up. And so the king wanted to make sure that they were not going to grow in number as much, because if all you have girls, you don't have any guys to populate. And so it makes it where that they would be lower in number. And into this comes Moses being born. Now, what does that remind you of? Doesn't that remind you of the time of when Christ was going to be born, and the king there said, execute all the children 2 and under, all the male children 2 and under, because a deliverer was coming. And they knew here that a deliverer was also coming here. They had been praying for it. They've been crying out for it. They've been turning to God. We know that because over in chapter 3, where Moses is talking to God at the burning bush, and God says to him, verse 6, chapter 3, verse 6, I am the God of the father, God of Abraham, of your father, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at him. And then he says, I indeed have seen the misery of my people in Egypt and have heard their crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering, so I came down to rescue them. Now, he's telling Moses this at the point where he's at the burning bush, which would mean he had to have been close to 80 years old at that point. However, the fact that Moses was born to be the deliverer was way back there 80 years before that. And so here's the point and the interesting thing about his birth. He was born to Hebrew people, and he was supposed to be killed. And of course, his mother was concerned about this. She was supposed to throw him in the Nile. And isn't that interesting? She did. She threw him in the Nile. But how did she throw him in the Nile? She put him in a basket so he'd be safe from the crocodiles, and he went down the river. She had his daughter, Moses' sister, watch him and see where he went. And so here, it's kind of like today. What is the law today? Do not get together. And if you get together, do not touch each other, do not breathe on each other, do not get together in a mass, and yet we're commanded to worship, to gather and worship. In fact, we're commanded, so it says, do not forsake the assembling of the saints together, and to greet each other with a holy kiss. So we're not supposed to do this stuff anymore. So how do we do that? Well, we follow the laws, but we at the same time we make sure we're doing what God commands. We gather in smaller amounts, maybe, or when we do gather, we hug or we do the handshake or whatever it is that we do to show we're a loving family, even though we've been commanded not to. We're following the law, and at the same time, we're following God's law, just like she did, putting this child in the Nile, but in a basket. And we don't understand in all reality, or at least we don't realize the extent of the crocodiles that were in the Nile eating these children. Of course, the more you feed them, the more they're going to be there. And then the child goes down the water. You remember the story, and is found by the king's sister. And here's the sister of Moses come up saying, "Hey, king's sister, would you like to have him nursed?" And she says, "I know a woman who'll nurse him." Of course, that would be his mother. And so she said, "Yes, do that, and bring him to me when he is weaned." And so his mother did that. And so what did he receive in the process? Well, he received a raising. He was not only raised in Pharaoh's home later, but he was raised by his mother to begin with. So that the point where he knew who he was, knew who he was, what his family was, and how they were different from the Egyptians. And when he grew up, he understood that and realized that. And it reminds us of the scripture in Proverbs where it says, "Raise up your child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not forget it." So then he was raised as Pharaoh's sister's son in Pharaoh's home, in the king's palace, and learning all the things that the king knew. Okay, now that's his birth and raising, and he has every responsibility, right, and consequences of following whichever way he thinks is right. Is he to follow the God that he knows of, that had the covenant with Abraham, or is he going to follow the gods of Egypt, and do what is there? So this is what's in his reasoning. How does he take these two things that are exposed to him and rationalize them out? And guess what? That's the same thing that you do today. The world gives you what they say is truth, and God gives you truth. And you're exposed to both truth and lies of the world, truth of God and the lies of the world, and you're to decide who you are, and the consequences will come. Well, what did he do? He saw that he was an Egyptian, Israelite. He saw an Egyptian damaging an Israelite, and he kills him, and then he has to flee for his life. Pharaoh or king put out an edict that he was to be killed, and so he runs away. So this brings about the kind of decisions that he has made. Notice his raising brought about his reasoning and his decisions. Even though they're his own responsibility, he had a very good home rationale and understanding of who God is before he went to Pharaoh, and probably they continued on over the years because of the fact that he knew that was his mother, his real mother. And God put him in this position so he could understand both of these and make the proper decision. And that's kind of interesting. You and I are in the world today, and we're supposed to be in the world. We're not supposed to go and get some monastery or something and separate ourselves from the world and make it where we never live with or be with the world. We're just supposed to not be of the world, meaning we're not supposed to think the same way and act the same way and desire the same things that the world acts, thinks, and desires. And so his decision making took him and made him leave. He was not going to act as an Egyptian, and he was going to act as a man of God, as a man of a Hebrew, an Israelite who's going to follow the covenant of Abraham. And I'm using this word Israelite, but in all reality, that wasn't what they would be called until the time they came out, because then they were no longer a tribe, but a whole nation. So his decisions made it where he had to leave Egypt. Isn't that interesting? He's born and he's raised and he's treated by both houses as someone important. He reasons his life out according to God's desires and makes his decisions accordingly. And then he's chased away. Comes as the deliverer. Now, this took 40 years of his life. When he went off to run away from Egypt, he knew the king's men would come after him and everything, so he decided to go far enough away where they wouldn't find him. He goes up to an area, and when he goes up there, he is, excuse me, he's running, and he goes and he stops at this well, and he sees some women there with their sheep, and they other shepherds come up and knock those women's sheep out of the way, shoot them out of the way so their own sheep could get. They were just bullying and cruel, and it shows the kind of person Moses is. Not only is he a leader, but he also is powerful, capable. He had been raised in Pharaoh's house, and so he probably was taught all kinds of self-defense and fighting and so on and so forth. And here he was, easily got rid of these shepherds and allowed the women to come back. And it even says that he watered the sheep and everything. And so the father, who was a priest, gave him one of his daughters. I think her name was Zipporah, and she married him, and he had a child. And the child he had, he named it. Man, it's funny how when you go looking for these things, it's obvious you can't see them. But anyway, he named her something weird. And here, let's see. Wait a minute. Gershom. Gershom means I have become an alien in a foreign land. Now, think about that. Remember, we realized he was an Israelite fighting against his upbringing as an Egyptian, and this war in his mind, he finally rationalized it out and became set on the fact that he was an Israelite and non-Egyptian. And so here he had to run away, and he's up here in this other country, and how does he feel? He feels like an alien. He's an alien where he is. He's an alien where he grew up. He has no home. He has nothing. He feels like he belongs nowhere. Now, isn't that interesting? But what he became then was he became a shepherd and was out feeding sheep. And this took another 40 years. So here he is, getting close to 80 years old, and he is shepherding these sheep. And while he's out there, you know the story here, God comes and talks to him through a burning bush. He sees a bush. It's not burning. It's burning, but it's not being consumed. Now remember, the definition of a miracle is the process, the action is happening, but without the process. So here the plant is burning. That's normal. A forest fire happens, but the tree's not being consumed. It's just on fire. See, so that doesn't make sense. Water turns to wine, but when when water is wine instantly, that doesn't make sense. That shows it's a miracle. It's beyond what he would have been able to see normally. And so he sees this tree over there, and this tree's on fire, and it grabs his curiosity, and he goes, and of course, he goes there and hears God's voice. And God tells him, you know what, Moses, you're going to have to go back and bring these people out. Well, he knows that it would not be good for him to go back, because he knows that Pharaoh probably still has a rule out against him, even though at this time there's a new king or a new Pharaoh, and time has passed by. If the old king did not know God, guess what? This one here is certainly not going to know him. And yet God tells him, you've got to go do this. And he makes all kinds of excuses, of course, and God sets where he has to go and deliver his people. And he's got to go back, and he's got to face Pharaoh. He's got to go in there to Pharaoh's place and demand him to let the people go. I was teaching a bunch of young kids one time. They're like 3, 4, or 5-year-old, and we're in, which is my speed. And I'm teaching them about this. And so every time I said, Moses said to the Pharaoh, let my people go. And the children would answer for Pharaoh, and he would say, no. And other times the children would say, let my people go. They'd scream it out, Very good way to teach the kids this story. But when he did this, he had to face him. He had to face him intentionally, because he wanted Pharaoh to know who was God. And we're going to see next week, when we talk about the 10 plagues, we're going to see that it was important for God to show the Israelites who was the true God, because every one of the plagues that came upon Pharaoh and the people were against the gods of Egypt. Now, that's very important, because as he faces Pharaoh here, he's doing so as God's advocate. He's doing so as God's ambassador. And just like you and I face people today, and when we face people and they're doing wrongly, and we're saying to them, look, stop this attitude and start following God, we're saying, you need to hear God. We are his ambassador. Okay, so in this, he turns around and trusts God that what God has said is correct, and what God has said he would do, he will do. And how did he have to do that? God had given the ability to see the burning bush and hear him. He knew of his fathers before him, Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, and he knew these stories and all. He knew that they had been God had been faithful to him. He knew about the famine, all that sort of stuff. And so he turns and he trusts God in this area. And listen to what God says to him in chapter 6 and verse 2. God said to Moses, I am the Lord. These words don't carry with it the packages that we have today. Here he is on top of Mount Sinai. He's in Egypt, and he's telling him he wants him to deliver them out, and you've got to trust me. And he says, I am the Lord, meaning I am in absolute control. People today don't think God's in control. You know what they believe? They believe global warming. They believe that we need to save this or save that. We're overpopulated. They do not believe that God is in control and has told us to do these things by trusting him and not trusting to ourselves. He says, I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, God Almighty, and by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. Also established my covenant with them and gave them the land of Canaan and so on. And he says, so here's what I want you to do, verse 6. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I'll bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I'll free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. He's saying, look, I'm going to take you out. And so he does. And he then becomes this deliverer to bring them as an advocate or as an ambassador. But who is really delivering them? Not Moses. He's only the one with skin on that you can see. But rather God is bringing them out, and when he does, he brings them well. So here he is now as the leader, and he's got a mantle of leadership. Let me tell you something. That has got to be the toughest job ever. If we were to read these scriptures from Exodus 7 all the way through Deuteronomy 34, as you know, Moses is the one who wrote the first 5 books. So we see at the end of in Deuteronomy, he's dead. So when the next book is Joshua, is because Joshua took over and led them into the promised land. Well, here they are. They're going to have to leave Egypt, and when they leave Egypt, then they're going to have to go across the sea, and they're starting to complain at him like crazy. They've already complained about the fact they had to make bricks without straw, and now that they're doing this, God takes them over and he shows them his power. After he had destroyed walked them over on dry ground, he destroyed the Egyptian army in the water. He sets them up there with the rumbling cloud on top of them, and God goes up to see them. And you know the story, they make the idols down below and start reveling, which means sexual immorality and everything at the bottom, while he's giving them the 10 Commandments. And God is trying to impress upon them who he is and what he needs them to do. And they're supposed to follow Moses into the promised land. But you know what? These people are so bad that they don't get it. They said, what's going on? Why is it that we are supposed to be following Moses, but nothing's happening? And God tells them, okay, your trip's canceled. And you don't trust me. You don't trust me going into Canaan. You're afraid, so you're out of here. And he makes them wander for 40 years. Now, could you imagine the pressure of that being on them? It got so bad, even though he was there in his presence, even though they could see God in the cloud every day and see him in a pillar of fire every night. Moses got so fed up with them by feeding them and watering them, even though God did not had made sure that the conditions were such they couldn't get food any other way than but through him. And Moses got irritated at them and at one point struck the rock instead of speaking to it and said, we have to do this instead of God does this. And so God said, okay, Moses, you can't go into the promised land. This is your punishment. And Moses was still alive and kicking and doing well at 120. And who takes over but Joshua, and Joshua buries Moses. This is a fascinating story, but Moses is. Now don't forget this, that this is who Moses is, and then next week we're going to look at why these things happen and how God tried and wanted to make sure these people who came out of a batch of lies could follow him, know him, and do exactly what he said, and that is us today. We'll talk more about that next week. Okay? Bye-bye.